Welcome to the GovX Show, a podcast series dedicated to public sector transformation as we count down to the GovX Digital conference, the UK's largest government transformation event in November. I'm James Smith and I am the content director here at GovX Digital, and today we're catching up with one of our speakers at the conference, Miranda Sharp. Miranda sits on the Smart London board and has held a number of roles, which I suppose a common thread would be that there's always been a very strong focus on maximising the value of data at both a city and national level. So we're fortunate to have Miranda joining us for our conference session on open government, alongside the Chief Data Officer of the State of New Jersey in the US and the Director General of Open Government of Buenos Aires in Argentina. Some of the focus for the session is going to be on the role of private data and how it creates public value, as well as the implications for the public sector of an emerging data economy. But let's crack on with getting to know Miranda a little bit better. So welcome to the show, Miranda.
Thank you very much, James. It's lovely to be here.
It's great to have you. So I thought first off we could start by asking you to tell our listeners a bit more about yourself and your current role at the Smart London board, as well as some of your interests away from work.
Oh, well, thank you very much. So yes, I'm delighted to be part of the Mayor's Smart London board, which works with the Chief Digital Officer in London, Theo Blackwell. And it's a bunch of different people with different perspectives who are looking to improve the experience of London for the entrepreneurs who provide services there, and the businesses who work within London, to the people who live, work and visit in London. And we have a particular emphasis on data and new technology. I also work with something at the University of Cambridge called the National Digital Twin Programme, where we're looking to bring together data for the public good at a national, local and maybe even international level. And finally, I work with the Centre for Cities think tank, which is looking at the performance of different cities across the UK with a view to see what we can do to improve productivity at a national level. Oh, and then away from work, I've always been a bit of a sports person, really. So I went what felt like a terribly sensible journey at the time, originally from being a swimmer to a water polo player to becoming a rugby player. I'm no longer able to get low enough or run fast enough to play rugby, so now I take my frustrations out on inevitably smaller people on the hockey pitch.
I feel that there's an interesting segment on examining your hockey career, because we spoke about this before we press record on the episode. But let's see if we get time for that at the end of the show. But I suppose looking at your professional career, I mean, what came first, the emphasis on data or the interest in working in the public sector?
Oh, that's really interesting. Well, I have a science degree, and so data has always been quite important to me, but I don't.
Just for the record, I'm a historian, and data was pretty important to us art graduates too. I can already see that there's a sort of science arts divide, sort of narrative, sort of emerging into this. So I just had to put it out there. But
I don't quite know where to go with my apology from that. I have learned recently that history is the most data-driven of the arts subjects. So we may or may not choose to agree on that. But I spent a lot of my university career processing data. And so I'm quite interested in how data tells the story of how it was collected. And the frailties in data, which only become obvious which you use it for a purpose for which it wasn't originally collected, are interesting in and of themselves. So I've been sort of interested in that forever, let us assume. And I suppose very early on, my first roles as I was emerging from education were entirely in the private sector. There's a lot to learn in the world of work when you're new to it. One of which you may well be talking about with other contributors. The people who I think are really missing out in these sort of weird times are people who are not learning those weird lessons in the world of work, who aren't learning how to communicate with people who are very different ages or very different backgrounds, in an office or a workplace environment. And so as I was learning that in a purely private sector environment, I thought this is all very interesting, but the goal here is to make money. And whilst that is a laudable and necessary ambition, you might be doing it at the expense of somebody else. And I'm just a little bit perhaps too idealistic to believe that can be the only reason that we're on the earth. And so I started leaning more and more towards the public sector and public service. And I suppose I also held the rather lofty ambition that surely there is somebody in government, or there is some magical place in government where they are able to take the entirely holistic view, look at all the available data and make the best possible decision to join this up so that we can live our best lives. And so maybe in the middle of that maelstrom of idealism is where I have found myself.
Have you found, if not that fabled place, have you found people that you think are on their way to that same location, that mythical nirvana of using data across the public sector to create value?
I have a good friend who works in government who says that every time he goes to a meeting he comes away with always with the answer. The answer is more joined up government. No, the answer is never anything else. And I think now I am prepared to believe that no such magical room exists where everybody has all the data they need at exactly the right set of time series and with all the right permissions to share it. I know that room cannot possibly exist. And actually, and forgive the tangent, the thing that worries me most of all is when I look at these fabled smart cities dashboards. Yeah. People have these sort of blinking lights and figures and streams of real-time data. What worries me about that is that people think the answer is real-time data rather than appropriately investigated time series data. So it may be interesting to know what how full the train carriages are at this precise moment. What is much more interesting and very important that we research is what causes train carriages to be full. So are they always full on a Tuesday? Why do we send empty double-decker buses down Regent Streets in the middle of the day? Why is that the best use of resources? What are they sometimes full or are they never full? So what changes might we be making? So setting aside the real-time versus not real-time data, do I still believe in this nirvana? I think it is a laudable aspiration, and I think it is one to which many people hold dear. But I think we're not going to get there in one bound. And I am hopeful that enough people are minded to join up bits of data to make better decisions than there have been before, and the technology now exists to support them.
I think sort of that magic room which we haven't found. I mean, it seems predicated on the idea of situational awareness, which obviously is one way of looking at data and the importance of real-time data if you're managing a particular situation, particularly a sort of public safety sort of related issue perhaps. But obviously, as you said, there is a deliberative and sort of interpretive aspect to processing data, which is not all about how recent is the last piece of information to flash across the screen, but rather have we had the time to sort of dig into and understand correlations with other data sets and sort of other things going on in the environment.
Yeah.
So moving on then, I suppose looking back at your career, what advice would you give a younger version of yourself when it comes to the steps, if not the missteps, that you've made?
So to this I defer to Douglas Adams. Don't panic. You don't have to achieve it all at once. You don't have to get all the experience for your last job in your next job. And enjoy every moment. So often when you're climbing a mountain, you realize the best view was 10 minutes ago. It gives the impression that I climb a lot of mountains, but take the time to enjoy and learn from every experience. I think is the advice I would like to give everybody. And I wish I had been sage enough to take it. So you may very well hate some aspects of your current role, and you've got the opportunity to change it, and you should be working to change it, but don't focus on the thing that can eat you from the inside. Think about the thing that gets you out of bed and the days that you enjoy, and do all you can to enjoy them. I think maybe that's my attitude to life. But I think, you know, I was always trying to grab the next opportunity, and sometimes forgot that to really reflect and insist that I enjoy that the bits I enjoyed came with me.
I wish I'd discovered the concept of mindfulness about 20 years earlier than I did, because certainly the younger, more striving to get ahead version of myself would probably have benefited deeply from that.
How do you think the younger version of yourself would have taken that advice?
I think I'd have said it's not about I don't know really. Bearing in mind that I spent lots of my career overseas, I think I would have made more time for exploring the places that I was fortunate enough to live in whilst I was living overseas, rather than spending quite so much time in the office and progressing the career, which obviously had got me overseas, which obviously was a worthwhile endeavour in and of itself. But nonetheless, when you're given the opportunity to spend a lot of time in interesting places, then the more time you spend exploring them, probably the better. So I think that's possibly a different approach I'd have taken. How about you?
Well, that's sort of oh gosh, it's the 5 capitals model. Work out. You can't measure success of a career on one dimension. Think about the other dimensions of a career that you can measure it on. I think that would have been a really good lesson. I think, how would I have taken that advice? That's all right for you. You do have a stable job. You're happy with your level of income. I don't know I'm going to get there. So maybe it's a confidence play.
Or naivety. I probably had the naivety to imagine that it was going to be okay regardless. But anyway, can't go backwards. Don't need to. Forwards. So obviously, this year has been an interesting year. How have you been sort of keeping well through the stresses and strains of post-COVID life?
It's been a really interesting year for us as a family. I think I've been lucky that I've done it as a family. I'm extremely fortunate. I look out on my wonderful vegetable patch and a new flower bed that my husband dug me for Christmas, which was the most delightful gift I've ever had. So I was made redundant, and it was predictable. It's sort of in the middle of the COVID thing. It wasn't a COVID decision, which meant that I've had the time to spend time in my garden, to do my exercise outside, and to spend the time with my family that a full-time role, commuting for a couple of hours a day, didn't give me access to. So yes, maybe I've finally taken that advice and smelled the flowers on the way up the hill. As I said before, I'm very lucky, and the people I'm worried about are the people who aren't blessed with a study, with enough social capital in the environments in which they work, that I can still ring people and they'll talk to me over Zoom. I've been working with a recent graduate on another project, and he said normally I would position myself in the office within the eye line of the person I had to get to talk to that day. And when they went and made themselves a coffee, I was straight in their wake, and I got them and I got the advice I needed there and then. And that person doesn't have that access in this sort of really weird Teams universe where suddenly it's acceptable to be in meetings 9 till 6 with no breaks at all, and you've lost all the serendipity in the office, and it's the people who don't have that on which to draw that I fear for. And that bit is tough. But the lessons I've drawn and the happiness I'm taking out of it is that we've learned how to we've learned what's important to us, and for me, I've really enjoyed my family time at home. Though I am delighted that they're going back to school, and I can have a proper think in peace.
I do think that when I look back at my career, I mean, I learned through sort of obviously physical contact and sort of mentoring inside the office. And, you know, I'm not entirely sure how I would have developed, you know, the skills and I suppose the understanding of how to work with people to achieve sort of shared outcomes, which came with, you know, learning by doing. And obviously when people are sat in their, you know, on their own in Zoom or alone at their laptop, I struggle to see how they're going to sort of build up that same level of learning and understanding. So I think that that's a real challenge. So as mid-career professionals, very happy to sort of avoid long commutes and sort of, you know, as you say, we have the network which we can tap into very easily, but it's a very different story for many people in the workplace.
Well, let's start with what's in the news. You know, we've got relatively few people back in Whitehall, and why would you? I've got time. I've got a lot more time, a lot more money, because I'm no longer spending quite so long commuting in. But then, if I'm running a Whitehall department, why am I paying London wages if people don't want to come here? And so we see that tension played out. And at the same time, as we spoke about before, you know, the people who need serendipity. And, you know, when we spoke, I've been on a conference call where people have talked about the home basing of call centres. There's a lot of evidence that people are more productive at home in a role like that, but less happy. And so I think we will be forced to ask ourselves questions about the role of the office space. And with the role, the cost and the function of office space. So I can imagine from my perspective that, and I've always been somebody that's barely been in the office, that, you know, there is a day a week when we go into the office, and we do that purely or mostly for the purpose of catching up with each other and serendipitous encounters. But then that's quite difficult to arrange in a whole day. So how do you do it? And, you know, clearly I say clearly. So there will be some things that people need to be around each other for. And it's you know, we might be able to continue a relationship over Zoom, but relationships are harder to start over Zoom. And certainly, you know, getting teams to form is something that's very difficult over Zoom, because you're so reliant upon those sort of one-on-one connections. I think the working pattern will be more engineered and more considered, and that might be a good thing. But it will change our relationship. My husband talks a lot about how it might change our relationship with our communities. So instead of people that we all travel to work on the tube with, you know, they might be the people that we share the co-working space in the library or the pub with. And what will that do for the cross-fertilization of ideas? I don't know. And certainly the research on cities and towns is that, you know, London in particular suffers as a result of previously being a sort of an office worker serving economy. You know, and how does it then re-emerge? You know, there's an excellent series of articles about the benefits of agglomeration. Tim Harford, in his excellent book, 50 Things That Made the Modern Economy, his 11-minute podcast on lifts says that mass horizontal transport and the concentration of people leads to an enormous jump in productivity and idea generation. And the challenge is, how do we replicate that when people no longer want to be so physically proximal for so long? I think there's quite a big answer there, which is hiding up I don't really know, but then I don't think any of us do.
I think that it's important to remember we're only 6 months into this sort of epochal transition to sort of a very different way of working, and that a lot of the patterns will emerge, and also the tools that will support those patterns, are still under development or haven't been developed yet. So it's it's very much a question of watch this space, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, at the conference, you're going to be joining us to examine, I suppose, what a data economy looks like, and sort of what role government can play in that. Why does that matter?
So public sector data is a big asset. I think I'm uncontentious in saying that. But in fact, data is a big asset to any enterprise. And I think one of the things certainly we've seen over the sort of my career is the border between public and private sector is increasingly porous. And what we might regard as public sector data may well be in the hands of a private contractor. So when we talk about public sector data, we're not just talking about public sector data. And people are familiar with the idea that data is an asset to people like Google and Facebook, because they recognize that their data means that they get a service for free. And equally, people are familiar with the idea that data gives us transparency, and that is a universal good. So things like the expenses services and transparency in government are enabled through the publication and sharing of data. And so that's an asset that means that we're living better lives and being more productive. But anybody who works with data will tell you they spend 80% of the time looking for it, organising it, finding it in the right format, making sure they've got the latest version, finding the password that they've forgotten and written down somewhere else, and then 20% of it, using it to make a decision. And so the argument is for good data, but sadly the technology and the business models and the attitudes towards it are maturing at all very different rates. And so we've got, we can imagine walking down an instrumented high street, and we might imagine that there's one all-seeing eye somewhere that knows exactly what I searched for on my phone as I passed that beacon, what my facial expression was as I passed that camera, and therefore infer exactly what I'm going to drink in the juice bar that I pop into when I next go past it. And this goes back to this, this mythical room where all the data has suddenly come together in a sensible format. It doesn't exist, even if the multiple entities that had access to all those different bits of data could agree data sharing agreements, and they were the right side of GDPR regulations. It's quite a sort of a crisscrossed world, the data economy. But one area that is certainly not mature at the moment is where we regard data as an asset. And there's been really well-made arguments for open data. I referred to them a moment ago, transparency and the like. And in fact, certainly in London, one of the arguments is that by TfL agreeing that it is not an app designer, it gave away all its data so that we no longer queue at bus stops. So suddenly we all know when the next bus is coming, and so we no longer queue. And that's a good thing for productivity. It makes people feel safer, and in fact probably increases bus utilisation. And what city isn't better for bus utilisation? But the valuation of that data asset is wrong. And so the favourite example I like to quote is that people who use Citymapper, and I am definitely one amongst them, and they took TfL's data, and suddenly they are now the owner and the people who best understand where people want to go and where they want to go, but the public transport system doesn't meet their demand. So suddenly, private enterprises which took open data have an asset which they are at liberty to sell back to the likes of TfL. Now that doesn't feel right to me. We should the people who are given an asset, the data asset, should have entered into an agreement The people who gave them the asset should also have entered into an agreement whereby some of that value returns to them so that they are better able to discharge their function. And I use the word carefully, value rather than money in that instance, because we're not in a position to value our data and our permissions. We just don't have the vocabulary and the models as of yet. So think about how when you sign up for free Wi-Fi, you would happily give away your firstborn. Click, click, whiz, whiz, yes, what you like. I'll have the Wi-Fi, thank you. We haven't, as a society and as a bunch of people, engaged with the value of our data. Partly, and we have sort of conflicting opinions on that. All the evidence is that people are delighted to give their data to, for example, one part of government, but entirely resistant to giving it to the tax office, because we believe that there's this magical room where it all comes together. And if people were honest about what they thought, what the data was going to be used for, and only what, and were also believable, then we might start to have a more mature discussion. But at the moment, what we're lacking is that mature discussion.
It strikes me that the hardest thing to get right is always around governance. But if we agree that, then it really unlocks the value of data. So how do you think that, I suppose, the theory and practice of data governance has been evolving here in the UK?
Well, I think the answer is evolving. And you design a system that works entirely for the situation as you either are in it or imagine it. So, for example, and I work quite a lot in infrastructure, where we have regulators in the UK which regulate for lowest consumer price. And who can say that that's not a laudable aim? It's measurable, and everybody. At the time, the perception was that there were a bunch of inefficient infrastructure companies who weren't prioritising the needs of their consumer. But now, for example, in water, we're in quite a different world where actually we need to have a sensible discussion. Are you prepared? How much more are you prepared to pay for access to sustainable water? And how much of the power budget of the UK are we willing to spend on giving us unlimited supplies of fresh water? And we now have the data now exists to have those nuanced debates, but the regulators don't exist to support it, because the regulator are only measured on the price that the consumer pays.
So I think on the panel, obviously, you're going to be alongside sort of Chief Data Officer from New Jersey and the Director General for Open Government in Buenos Aires, all very exotic. I mean, what are some of the things that you're looking to learn from their experience, or questions you might have for them?
I'm always fascinated to be on an international panel, because you imagine that these sort of situations and these challenges are common, and it's only when you sit and listen to these guys for a few minutes you realise quite how different it is. So I'm always very keen to understand the patchwork of accountabilities that different public sectors have. I mean, the same is true in the UK as well as it is globally. So, do you have responsibility for both health and social care? Can you use the pricing of transport to affect how people engage with active travel? And because, so for example, a dear colleague said, I only have responsibility for primary school education, and I know that if I invest appropriately in primary school education, I reduce the scale of the prison budget. The problem is I don't have the prison budget, and therefore however sensible I know it is, I can't make the case to invest in the way I want to as a human being. And I think you learn a lot about your situation if you see how these people have come to terms with a similar challenge, but with different constraints upon them, and you understand the constraints you're working under better, and therefore are in a better position to tackle them. So certainly I have heard the Americans speak, and one of the things, it was certainly the East Coast, and certainly she sat in a room of smart city experts, and she said, what you must all stop doing is giving away your data. And it was a very, very powerful moment for me when I heard that in Barcelona a few years ago.
So obviously, one of the design principles of the conference is that we are trying to sort of really sort of have an even balance between sort of the UK experience and obviously international perspectives. So hopefully there's plenty of scope for you to sort of, you know, have insights into what they're doing, not just in Argentina and the US, but obviously be a part of the sessions with other speakers as well. One of the things we're doing this year for the first time, we're putting together our first conference reading list. So this is an attempt to give ourselves some sort of highfalutin, highbrow credentials. So do you have any books or articles that you've read recently that you'd recommend professionally to the audience that we can add to that list?
So I'm an unashamed data geek on this subject, and not a very good reader. I can recommend some books, but also some podcasts and some videos you can watch which make it easier to consume for people like me. So certainly Hannah Fry's Hello World, about algorithmic transparency, which are also brilliantly portrayed in visual format in her Royal Institution Christmas lectures, which you should watch with your children. Because it's also about how to stay safe online. So it's excellent. And also Tim Harford's Cautionary Tales podcasts. Certainly the one I listened to felt like the middle of lockdown, about the suicide epidemic, which followed the Fukushima incident in Japan, which was a lesson in human resilience. Made me quite miserable actually for a while. So there was following the terrible disaster in Fukushima, it was only after 3 or 4 years that they saw a rise in suicide. And that's at the point at which people just got fed up with coping with so many constraints and so many difficult situations. And it's a lesson in how we need to track data for a long time and understand the stories behind people in order to get better outcomes. I'm in the middle of the book The Invisible Woman, which is about the unseen impact of public policy, or the bit I'm in, the unseen impact of public policy made on seemingly gender neutral data, where certainly overall the population has benefited from a decision, but it seems that men are a much easier audience segment to serve, and therefore women are underserved. It's a salutary read for anybody who is working in public service. Snow clearing in Sweden is the one that's I think easiest for me to translate. Entirely appropriately, originally the authorities in Sweden cleared the major roads, the minor roads, and then the footpaths. Probably because that was the easiest way to get the flipping snow plows about. And that meant that people could get to work and economic value could continue. Only when they looked at the data did they discover that most accidents actually happened on the footpaths, and then that was disproportionately women. And of course, when women drop out of activity, not only is their economic activity affected, but normally a disproportionate amount of other people. So their children can't get to school, and the elderly aren't cared for to the same extent. And so after the people in Sweden looked at this, they now clear the footpaths first. And although some workers can't get to work quite so quickly, the overall burden on the public sector is less.
Yeah, so a fitting place to end the episode. So Miranda, thanks ever so much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure chatting with you, learning a little bit more about your personal interests, your professional experience, and obviously your reading interests. And obviously, I'm certainly got a very good feeling for our panel discussion on open government at the conference, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Well, thank you very much. And if anybody's listening and has got any examples that they want me to include or think I should be including, then please get in touch. I'm keen. I haven't written my presentation yet. If anybody's got any brilliant ideas, I'm very keen to include them.
Thanks very much. We'll make sure that we ask the audience to submit their queries, questions, and suggestions in the show notes. So now's a great time for a gentle plug. So if you'd obviously like to listen to Miranda at the conference along with her fellow panelists, then their session starts at 3 p.m. on the 18th of November with a series of presentations with panel discussions starting at 4 p.m. All the details will be included in the show notes. So this has been the GovX Show. I've been James Smith, and you've been great. Until next time, it's cheerio from me and cheerio from Miranda.
Thank you.